Now, the Chancellor, we know, is due to announce a 2p cut to national insurance when he unveils his budget a bit later today, as well as extending the freeze on fuel duty.
To fund these tax cuts, Jeremy Hunt will reportedly extend the windfall tax on energy firms' profits for another year and scrap tax breaks for non-DOMs, two of Labour's key policies. Let's speak now to the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, who's in Westminster. Very good morning to you.
Morning.
My first question to you, Darren Jones, is if this cut in national insurance goes ahead, a 2p cut, and you win the next general election, is it something you would keep?
Well, good morning. We in the Labour Party have said for some time that we want taxes on working people to come down because they're the highest they have been overall since the Second World War. The key question is how are those tax cuts going to be funded for the long term? And that is about getting the economy back on track and getting growth back into the economy. Now, the Chancellor will probably say today that his budget is a budget for growth, but this will be the 22nd time the Conservatives have said that since they've come into office in 2010. And where are we right now? We're in the middle of a recession.
Yeah, so going back to my question, would you keep the national insurance cut? Because he cut it by 2p back in the autumn statement. He's likely to cut it by 2p again today. That adds up to £900 for the average worker. So exactly as you said, you've repeated his mantra. It's a budget for growth. Would Labour stick by it?
Well, there were two different questions there, and I'll answer them in turn. First, in terms of what we inherit if we win the election this year, is clearly an inheritance from the Conservatives. And so this is a Conservative budget today, and they will set that out into the House of Commons, and we will see what he has to say later today. That will be, if we do win the election this year, the worst inheritance that any incoming party has had since the Second World War, and that is what we're going to have to work with. But on growth is super important because if our economy had grown at the average rate of the wealthy countries over the last few years...
The question was, would you keep this national insurance cut?
Yeah, so I've just said in answer to your first question from the previous question that we would keep what we inherit. Of course we would.
Okay.
We have our own plans, which we'll set out in the manifesto. But what I'm emphasising to answer the second part of your question was how important growth is. And I'll just finish that sentence by pointing out why. If our economy had grown at the average rate of the wealthiest countries in the world over the last few years, we would have £50 billion of free cash available now to invest in our public services. And that's why whether it's public service funding or whether it's funding tax cuts in a sustainable way for the long term, the root of that success is getting the economy growing. And the failure of the Conservatives of the last 14 years is we're going into this election in a recession because of their failure to get the economy growing. That's really, really important.
Just for clarity, you have sort of answered the question, but just for clarity, if it was your budget today, would you be announcing a cut of 2p in national insurance?
Well, it's not our budget today.
What if it was?
What we can't do is make kind of speculative decisions. What a Labour Party will do responsibly and in an orderly fashion will be to look at the detail today from the Conservatives and what we hope will be their final budget before the next general election. And that will inform our manifesto, which will be fully funded and fully costed.
Okay,
and at that stage, you will see our priorities coming into the election later this year.
Because one of the things that voters can quite reasonably ask is what would Labour do? So we've already had a commitment from you today that you would stick with this national insurance cut. So we know that you would do that because you've already junked your green investment plan, £28 billion a year, which Sir Keir Starmer said was desperately needed. He's rolled back on a number of other pledges. Of course, he originally wanted to abolish tuition fees. He's rolled back on that. He wanted to nationalise a huge number of public services. I'm not sure what the current plan is on that. He also wanted to scrap the two-child limit on benefits, and he's rolled back on that. So we are rather in a void when it comes to knowing what Labour would do.
Well, firstly, I don't think we're in a void, but just to answer the premise of your question, there are lots of things that a Labour Party would like to do coming into government. Of course we would. But the fact is we have to deal with the books as we inherit them from the Conservatives. And they've spent all the money. They've maxed out the country's credit card. Debt is higher than it has been since the Second World War for the government. The interest payments are now over £100 billion a year in the last financial year, making it the third largest department in Whitehall. The Labour Party will be a responsible party that can be trusted on the economy. We won't be able to do everything we want to do immediately because of the dire state of the economy and our public services.
All right.
We're just being very honest and frank with the public about that. But you will see in our manifesto that we have plenty of policy based on our 5 missions for the country where we're going to tackle these structural problems for the long term and get the economy back on track and make people better off.
You are streets ahead of the Conservatives in the polls. If anything, the gap gets wider and wider. But, of course, there's many a slip twixt cup and lip. And is one of those slips possibly the reappearance of George Galloway? He's making all sorts of threatening noises, isn't he? He's actually threatening your deputy leader, Angela Rayner, in her seat, saying he thinks that his lot can take it.
Well, look, I mean, what George Galloway says is up to him. There will be a general election this year, and in Rochdale we will have a Labour candidate that we will put forward in that election. And I think people across the country will be looking at the national picture. They'll be looking at the failure of the Conservatives of the last 14 years. We hope concluding that it's time for change and electing a Labour government so that we can put into effect our policies that will benefit the people of Rochdale, but also the people of across the whole of the United Kingdom in the years to come.
One of the reasons that he won so extraordinarily handsomely in Rochdale was because of his position on Gaza, which is many miles away from the Labour Party's position. Has that given you food for thought? Might Labour change its policy a bit on Gaza?
Well, the Labour Party policy on Gaza is that there should be an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. That was approved by the House of Commons only a couple of weeks ago. I think one of the main reasons that George Galloway did well in Rochdale was that the Labour Party, unfortunately, didn't have a candidate
he's beaten Labour candidates before, hasn't he?
Well, sure, but he didn't on this occasion because there was no Labour Party candidate.
And whose fault is that?
Well, it's the candidate's fault who was the Labour Party candidate for saying things that are
unacceptable. It's the Labour Party mismanagement of that candidate.
No, it's not mismanagement, if I might say so. I mean,
you didn't take action swiftly enough on your candidate. You had to withdraw support for that candidate beyond the deadline, which means you couldn't field a candidate that you supported.
The decision was taken within 48 hours of the evidence appearing that the candidate at that stage had said things that were unacceptable. And it was a testament to Keir Starmer's leadership and the fact that the Labour Party has changed, that even in that circumstance where we couldn't change our candidate and therefore had to forfeit our opportunity to put a Labour candidate before the people of Rochdale, who we think deserve a good Labour MP, that we took that decision to say that we couldn't back that candidate.
Imagine if that happened at a general election.
Well, all of our candidates go through a robust due diligence process, but if any candidate ends up in
Rochdale.
But if any candidate ends up in a position where they do not meet the standards of the Labour Party, they will not be Labour Party candidates.
Well, speaking of being fit for an election, what do you make of Peter Mandelson's comments about your leader's weight? He says that Mr Starmer needs to lose a few pounds.
I've been asked repeatedly about that this morning, and I have to say I've not listened to the podcast where Peter had made that point. The only observation I've made so far this morning is that, you know, Keir is 61, but he's able to get through more football matches each week than I probably can, and I'm 37. The fact of the matter is that from the very top of the Labour Party with Keir Starmer all the way through to our candidates in every constituency across the country, the Labour Party is fit and match ready for the election, which we hope will come and be announced in a matter of weeks for May the 2nd.
Do you ever think it's appropriate to comment on a candidate's weight?
Look, it's not for me to tell people what is appropriate for them to comment on or one way or the other way, but all I know is that...
exactly what politicians do.
Well, listen, you're looking pretty trim. Do you do your 10,000 steps a day?
I actually do normally, because I walk a lot when I'm here in Westminster, and I try to exercise as much as I can. Politics can be a very unhealthy endeavour for lots of people. It's important you get the balance right.
All right, well, stay healthy. Thank you for joining us.